What are some of the regular monthly religious observances?
The Hindu sense of sacred time presents an enormous array of possibilities, depending on various combinations of astrological phenomena. Auspicious days of the week, and associations of times with particular deities. Different days in both dark and bright fortnights of each lunar month carry generic spiritual values. Most sacred is the 11th day, while the 1st, 4th, 9th, and 14th are inauspicious. Some days are consecrated to different deities. More special occasions fall during the bright than during the dark half. During one half, both halves in some months and/or regions, the 4th day belongs to Ganesha, the 8th to Durga, the 9th and 11th to Vishnu, a solar deity, and the 13th to Shiva, a lunar deity. New moon days find some Hindus offering special meals to placate the spirits of the dead. Many of these monthly or semi-monthly occasions include a fast. Most Hindus observe only some of these special days, depending on their sectarian affiliation.
What other ideals does the Hindu tradition recommend?
A classical formulation of the ideal life cycle is called the 4 stages of life. It applies almost exclusively to males, but the implications for women are fairly clear. The traditional system is called Varnashramadharma. The law, dharma, of caste, varna, and life stage, ashrama. Upper caste Hindu males begin the cycle as students, in a stage between the ages of 12 and 24. Under the tutelage of a guru, young men learn the basic sacred traditions, rituals, and sacred texts. From ages 24 to 48 they become householders, marrying and raising a family according to conventional norms. During these first 2 stages, men seek religious fulfillment by turning outward and engaging their world with extroverted energy and drive. At 48 a man enters into the stage of a forest dweller or senior mentor to younger men. Some still actually move toward a life of greater solitude during this stage. Even if not literally heading for a hermitage in the forest. Some men past the age of 72 enter the stage of the renunciant or sannyasi. They formally set aside as many ordinary ties to their former lives as possible, leaving behind wealth as well as material responsibility in quest of self-realization. Both of the latter 2 stages call for increasing introspection and time for personal prayer and devotion. Though fewer individuals follow the 4 stages formally now than in the past, the cycle remains a traditional ideal and a useful map of spiritual progress for those who choose to pursue it.
What were the earliest Buddhist sacred texts?
For several centuries the Buddhist community preserved the treasure of the Buddha's teachings orally. Monks and devout laypersons memorized increasingly formulaic versions of what the Buddha had said and the way he had behaved. as the community of monks became more stable, settling for longer periods in fixed residences. The practice of communal recitation of the sacred words became the primary mechanism for maintaining the teachings intact. Any error in recitation could be corrected immediately to ensure uniformity and, it was believed, perfect accuracy. Local communities recited the text in their own vernaculars, since no one sacred language had been decreed. Earliest texts were organized into three major groupings or baskets, Pitaka. 1. Called the Vinaya Pitaka, contained all the rules of monastic discipline. Another gathered the Buddha's speeches, the Sutra Pitaka, and a third, much later. Text included 7 lengthy theoretical interpretations of the Buddha's teaching, the Abhidharma Pitaka. At a gathering called the Third Council in 250 BCE, members agreed on the first official formulation of all 3 baskets as a single scripture called the Tripitaka in a northeastern Indian language called Pali. Monks continued to keep the texts alive almost exclusively through memory for perhaps another century or so. Finally, the sacred texts were systematically committed to writing and became the basis of what is now known as the Pali Canon.
Who was Buddha?
According to legend, the Buddha was a strikingly handsome man. One very respected Brahmin leader, Kanki, said of him, "The recluse Gautama is lovely. Good to look upon, charming, possessed of the greatest beauty of complexion, of sublime color, a perfect stature, noble of presence." For many years Buddha's followers refused to paint the Buddha in a human form. They believed that he had moved on to a place greater than their human domain. Later, however, they began to see him and depict him as possessing the 32 bodily characteristics of a Mahapurusha, great person.
What other early schools and scriptures are especially important in the history of Buddhism?
A number of early Buddhist schools or denominations arose in India during the 5 or 6 centuries after the Buddha's death. One cluster, known collectively as the Hinayana, small vehicle, schools, developed as a result of differing interpretations of what manner of being the Buddha was. The most important of these schools is the Theravada. Wisdom of the Elders, the branch largely responsible for the Pali Canon. Theravada Buddhists taught that the Buddha was a historical human being who counseled others to pursue their own path to enlightenment. But some Buddhists inclined toward more expansive, spiritual interpretation. The Mahasanghikas, proponents of the Great Assembly, taught that the Buddha's many previous lives as a Buddha to be a bodhisattva. Prior to his birth as Siddhartha Gautama meant that the Buddha was more of a cosmic spiritual being than a mere mortal. All but one volume of their sizable Sanskrit, called Buddhist hybrid, scriptures have been lost. Another school. The Sarvastivadins, proponents of the view that all exists, further emphasized the importance of the Bodhisattva's spiritual evolution as a model of growth in virtue. They, too, produced a body of sacred writing. But the Sanskrit originals were lost, and we know of them through Chinese and Tibetan translations. Next to the Theravada school, the most important of the early denominations was the Mahayana, Great Vehicle. So called because of its wider appeal. Mahayana teaching emphasized the larger-than-life qualities of the Buddha. More than a mere mortal, the Buddha was a saving figure whose compassion filled the universe and whose grace was available to all who asked. Mahayana scriptures in Sanskrit included sutras claiming to be the Buddha's own words, commentaries and treatises called shastras, and esoteric works called tantras used by smaller sects.
Are there Hindu fundamentalists?
If fundamentalism may be defined as an aggressive and intolerant religious exclusivism, there are several manifestations of it in the history of Hinduism. A 19th-century reformist movement called the Arya Samaj, Society of Aryans, sought to cleanse modern Hindu thought and practice of unnecessary clutter that had contaminated the tradition over the centuries. The society condemned not only Muslims and Christians but members of various Hindu denominations as well. To its great credit, the Arya Samaj attempted to make Hindu practice more egalitarian, giving women and socially marginal groups equal access. Another fundamentalist-style force in recent times has been the political faction called Bharatiya Janata or BJP. In 1992 the party supported agitation by the militant Vishva Hindu Parishad, Universal Hindu Assembly, to destroy a 16th-century mosque in Ayodhya. They wanted to replace the mosque with a temple to Rama and to rededicate the site as Rama's birthplace, which Muslims had desecrated centuries before. The VHP throws its considerable weight behind political candidates who promise to do whatever is necessary to keep power in the hands of Hindus.
Do Hindus believe in devils?
No single personification of evil functions in Hindu tradition quite like the Satan of other traditions. Multiple embodiments of malice, perversity, and general negativity are called asuras, or demons. Ancient myths tell of the ongoing struggle between the devas, deities, and the demons for control of the cosmos. Originally the demons were not necessarily considered altogether evil. Even their generic names are ambiguous. Deva is from the same root as devil, while Asura shows up in the name of the main Iranian deity, Ahura Mazda. Both deities and demons descended from Prajapati, lord of living things. Demons were at first ethically on a par with the gods. but the gods generally managed to win more battles than their siblings. Eventually the deities came to be known as more clever and more truthful. Finally, the gods achieved immortality while preventing the demons from winning that prize. Demons retained the ability to assume virtually any form in their attempts to disrupt cosmic affairs. Powerful people intent on evil could enlist the aid of demons to carry out their wicked deeds. Some demons came to represent impersonal negative qualities, such as ignorance. Lesser but still troublesome forces known as Buddhas remain important in the lives of many villagers. Buddhas are the spirits of those who died violently, or too young, or after betrothal but before marriage, for example. Resentful and frustrated, they wander about harassing the living unless appeased by proper rituals. Hindus believe that ultimately the divine power will overcome all demonic forces.
What solutions to the human predicament does Hindu tradition propose?
Hindus seek the ultimate spiritual goal of liberation through any of four traditional ways or paths called margas. Methods of seeking or yogas, joining by means of discipline. The most ancient and slowest method is that of ritual action, karma. Originally associated with scrupulous fulfillment of the prescriptions of Vedic ritual practice. Karma is kept within reach of contemporary Hindus by interpreting it as unselfish service. In that sense, the way of action recommends itself to all. Even in the absence of a vital tradition of ritual sacrifice. The second path begins with the conviction that ignorance causes suffering. Intuitive experiential knowledge, jnana, is available through various intellectual and meditative disciplines associated with a variety of philosophical approaches called darshanas, views. Most of all, the way of knowledge seeks the full realization of the perfect oneness of all reality and the illusory nature of our instinctive conviction that individuality of persons and multiplicity of all things is the substance of life. It is a difficult and abstract method attractive to relatively few people. Its best known form is that of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta school. Closely associated with the way of knowledge is a path that uses the formal disciplines popularly known as yoga. Proceeding from the conviction that suffering is the result of physical and mental distraction. Meditational yoga combines various physical practices, hatha yoga, designed to control one's physiological states, with belief in divine assistance toward higher contemplative states, Raja Yoga. Far more popular and accessible is the way of devotion or bhakti, participation. Whereas the way of knowledge seeks realization of a union that already exists in an impersonal ultimate reality, the way of devotion seeks to cultivate the union of the two distinct parties to the divine human relationship. Bhakti means dedication to a personal God whose love, mercy, and grace elicit a response of complete faith and surrender. It proceeds from the conviction that suffering arises out of separation from one's divine source and goal. the devotee approaches God in full confidence of divine protection and the hope of salvation.
What kind of religious calendar do Hindus observe?
Combining lunar months with seasons of the solar year. The Hindu calendar functions somewhat like the Jewish. About every 3 years it inserts an extra month after a month with 2 new moons. Hindu lunar months vary from 29 to 32 days. The names of the months, with the roughly corresponding Gregorian months in parentheses, are as follows. Chaitra, March/April, Vaishakha, April/May, Jyestha, May/June, Asadeh, June/July, Shravan, July/August. Bhadrapada, August/September, Ashvina, September/October, Kartika, October/November, Margasivsa. November/December, Pansa, December/January, Magha, January/February, and Falguna, February/March. Leap months take the name of the month preceding them. For ritual purposes, each month is divided into its dark and light halves, with associated celebrations. And the moment of full moon is a special time of celebration each month. And some festivals and observances fall each year on the same solar date. Each year is likened to a day in the life of the deities, with the solar solstices symbolizing sunrise and sundown. In addition to the complexity introduced by the blending of solar and lunar reckonings, systems vary still further from region to region in India. Historically, the greater Hindu religious calendar has been so full that virtually every day some Hindu community has celebrated something special somewhere in the subcontinent. Hinduism is not unlike Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions in that respect, except that the majority of the Christian religious feasts are those of saints, rather than of the deity as such. All of this makes for an immensely rich sense of the intersection of sacred times and places. Every day is appropriate for religious observance, and no one day of the week is set aside as an especially sacred time.
Was Buddhism ever identified with any political regimes?
Buddhism enjoyed the patronage of 2 very influential Indian monarchs. A ruler of the Maurya dynasty named Ashoka, r. 270 to 230 BCE, is credited with for the first dramatic expansion of Buddhism across much of India. He declared Buddhism the state creed and sent missionaries westward through present-day Afghanistan and south to Sri Lanka. Not until nearly 4 centuries later did Buddhism again profit from formal political support. A king of the Kushan dynasty named Kanishka, r. 120 to 162 CE, picked up where Ashoka had left off. In fact, Kanishka may have learned of Buddhism in his native land to the northwest of India as a result of Ashoka's earlier missionary endeavors. Kanishka launched a new wave of missionary activity, dispatching monks to China, Tibet, and Burma. But it was the newer Mahayana teaching that Kanishka supported. Only one other important Indian regime would give Buddhism the official seal of approval. From its capital in Bengal to the northeast, the Pala dynasty, 750-1150, supported a brand of Mahayana teaching that retained esoteric elements from Hinduism. Before the last of the Palas died, Buddhism would be nearly defunct in India. Outside of India, several Buddhist dynasties helped to establish the tradition in Southeast Asia. On Indonesia's central island, Java, the Shalandras, 778 to 864, professed a type of Mahayana teaching. Meanwhile, Buddhist monarchs helped the tradition take root in Tibet.
Is nonviolence particularly important in Hindu beliefs?
Leaders familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. may recall that he spoke of being especially influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's teachings on nonviolent resistance. Concern for ahimsa, non-injury, including respect for all forms of life, seems to have become an important theme in Hindu tradition following the rise of Buddhism and Jainism in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Ahimsa ranks first among a list of 10 spiritual qualities, called yamas, or restraints. In the classical system of yoga attributed to Patanjali, avoidance of all injury in word and deed began with the rejection of Vedic sacrifice and as a central practice of small groups of ascetics and grew to include the practice of vegetarianism.
What do Hindus think about history and time?
Imagine a bird flying past the Himalayas every 100 years, brushing the mountain peaks with the silk scarf it holds in its beak. What we call history is the time it would take that bird to wear the mountains flat. And that would be only an infinitesimal fraction of divine time. History is an infinite cycle made up of smaller, measurable cycles of creation and destruction, but even the smaller cycles are unimaginably long. Hindu myth says that God, manifested as Brahma the creator, unfolds the material world over and over. Each lifetime of Brahma lasts 100 divine years. Each day in the life of the creator deity is called a kalpa, lasting 4,320,000,000 years. Each kalpa, or great age, Mahayuga, in turn is made up of 4 ages or eons called yugas. The present cycle of human history began with the first yuga, a time of order and peace when the cosmic law, dharma, kept evil in check. During the second age, disorder entered history. Dharma diminished as did the span of human life. There followed a third age, when evil gained still greater strength and dharma weakened. Social fragmentation gave rise to the caste system and attempts to gain power through ritual sacrifice. We are now in the fourth and bleakest age. A time of darkness and lawlessness destined to end in 400,000 years. Then, after a period of quiescence, all will begin again, another day in the life of Brahma. Key concepts in Hinduism: Atman, the indivisible and indestructible spiritual center of each being, and the ultimate self underlying all reality. Avatar, a crossing over downward, a deities, especially Vishnu's descent into the world of human experience. Bhakti, participation, devotional relationship to one's chosen deity, a major path to liberation. Brahman, ultimate reality enveloping all appearances of multiplicity. Dharma, that which holds all things together, the cosmic law, religio-social propriety. One's individual religious duty, and one of the four acceptable goals of life. Jnana, knowledge, insight into the spiritual meaning of things, one of the principal paths to liberation. Kama, pleasure, one of the four legitimate goals of life. Karma, action, ritual, or ethical conduct and the consequences thereof. One of the traditional paths to liberation. Marga, path, way, method of spiritual progress toward liberation. Moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, ultimate goal of Hindu spiritual practice. Samsara, journeying, the endless round of rebirth from which Hindus seek to be free. Yoga, joining, harnessing, system of physical and spiritual disciplines practiced by a yogi.
Does that mean Hindus do not believe in heaven or hell?
Traditional Hindu cosmologies speak of three realms of existence or lokas. One scheme describes an in-between realm, Antarloka, where individual souls abide both during sleep and between incarnations. This reflects the persistence of important features of ancient Vedic views of the cosmos. A version of hell called Naraka, literally, referring to humankind, is a thoroughly unpleasant lower part of the Antarloka that functions rather like a purgatory. In any of its 7, or even as many as 21 levels, souls can overcome through suffering some of the effects of bad karma. A multi-leveled region called Anandloka, realm of bliss, also called Svarga, region of light, is roughly equivalent to a paradise or heaven. It is a temporary abode in which people who have died approaching liberation acquire knowledge that can assist them toward greater spiritual progress in their next life. Hindu cosmology includes multiple levels, both in this in-between realm and in the uppermost realms beyond that reserved for those who have achieved moksha. Most Hindus regard the intermediate equivalents of heaven and hell as temporary, although some smaller sects teach the existence of more or less permanent abodes of punishment in the next life.
How do Shaivites honor Shiva?
Shivaratri, Shiva's night is a monthly festivity occurring on the 14th night of the dark half of every lunar month, just before the appearance of the new moon. Once a year devotees observe Mahashivaratri, Shiva's great night, either during the midwinter lunar month called Magha or during the following month, Falguna, depending on regional custom. The feast celebrates Shiva's manifestation of his power and glory to Vishnu and Brahma in the icon called the Jyotirlinga or fiery linga. Girls who hope to marry soon often fast during the day and keep vigil all night. Festivities in parts of India generally last all night and often include massive street parties and processions featuring elaborate floats, ecstatic dancing, and sometimes extreme demonstrations of devotion in the form of self-mutilation. A full moon feast during Kartika, in the fall, is called Tripuri Purnima. It recalls how Shiva incinerated the demon Tripura's 3 cities, Tripuri, made of gold, silver, and iron. Meanwhile his consort Kali dispatched the demon himself, ending his partial dominion over heaven, earth, and hell, the 3 cities.
Are there other important cyclical observances based largely on celestial signs?
Every 3 years Hindus gather from all over India in one of 4 sacred cities: Hardwar, Prayaga, Ujjain, and Nasik, each on a different sacred river or confluence, for a huge religious fair called a Kumbhamela, Grainpot Festival. The mythological connection in the name is its reference to the kumbha, or vessel, from which drops of the nectar of immortality fell as the demons rested on their flight from the gods, making the 4 cities holy. Every 12 years, a series of astrological conjunctions make the gathering at Prayaga, known by Muslims as Allahabad, particularly auspicious. Since about the 8th century, travelers have made organized pilgrimages to the 4 cities to attain forgiveness of sins for themselves and 88 generations of ancestors by bathing in their sacred waters 4 times each year, corresponding to the 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes. Are particularly important events in the solar calendar. The beginning of every solar month is auspicious because of the sun's move into a new sign of the zodiac. But the winter solstice is the most important because it signals the lengthening of days and the beginning of the solar year.
Do Hindus believe in the concept of salvation?
Most Hindus prefer the way of devotion because it is so concrete and personal. Bhakti offers the assurance of divine aid in all of life's difficulties, as well as cause for rejoicing in better times. Seekers who choose any of the classical spiritual paths are aware that human beings are ever in need of help from sources beyond themselves. But the notion of salvation assisted by divine grace is especially strong in popular theistic or devotional Hinduism. even in the denominations that teach a modified form of predestination, such as those of Madhva and Vallabha. Grace is a central feature of bhakti. Since the human soul is, so to speak, naturally divine, grace is the power that refreshes and renews the soul in its original state. Hindus, like members of various other major traditions, have held differing views as to how divine grace works. A particularly vivid pair of images characterizes one view as that of the cat school, another that of the monkey school. According to the cat school, divine grace is all-sufficient and does not depend at all on human action. Mother cats carry their kittens around by picking them up with their teeth. According to the monkey school, human beings must cooperate in the saving action of divine grace. Mother monkeys rescue their babies from danger, but the baby first climbs aboard and holds tight.
How did Gautama become the Buddha?
At the age of 29, tradition says, Gautama made the great renunciation of comfort and security. Borne aloft by his horse, he went over the palace walls to pursue a realistic understanding of the world and the human condition. Gautama went first to learn from two Hindu teachers, spiritual guides like those who tutor seekers in the Hindu scriptures called the Upanishads. Unsatisfied with that more philosophical approach, Gautama joined a group of ascetics in Benares. Representatives of the Jain movement perhaps, and subjected himself to several years of dire austerity. When that, too, failed, he moved on and decided to meditate alone under a tree until he achieved enlightenment. During the course of 7 weeks there, Siddhartha went through 4 trance-like stages, arriving finally at the stark realization of what Buddhist tradition calls the most basic truths of human life. Siddhartha was now worthy of the name Buddha, the enlightened one. But tradition suggests that the Buddha experienced a terrible interior struggle with the temptation to keep his newfound wisdom to himself. Mara, the demon, summoned up all his might to prevent the truths of enlightenment from spreading abroad. Overcoming all inclination to selfishness, the 35-year-old Buddha dedicated himself to teaching others the way to freedom from attachment that is the cause of all suffering. He returned to Benares, reunited with the 5 ascetics with whom he had parted company earlier, and preached the sermon called Turning the Wheel of the Law. Now the Buddha was indeed a wheel turner, but not as his father had envisioned. For the next 45 years, he would turn the greatest of all wheels, that of the Dharma. He died in Kushinagara at the age of 80, in about 463 BCE, of apparent food poisoning. Buddha on the big screen, some favorite motion pictures. Green Snake, 1993. A combination of mysticism and action based on a Chinese fable. Green Snake, Maggie Cheung, and Sun Qing, Joey Wang, are actual reptiles who have been practicing taking human form. When self-righteous Buddhist monk Fa Hai discovers them, He thinks it's a sin to tamper with the natural order. Cantonese with English subtitles. Kundan. 1997, in 1937, in a remote area of Tibet close to the Chinese border. A 2-year-old child is identified as the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the compassionate Buddha. He is brought to Lhasa to be schooled as a monk and as head of state. The film follows him into adulthood until his flight to India after the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Little Buddha. 1993, Tibetan Lama Norbu informs the Conrad family of Seattle that their 10-year-old son Jesse may be the reincarnation of a respected monk. Stars Keanu Reeves? 7 years in Tibet. 1997, Heinrich Harrer, Brad Pitt, travels to the Himalayas on a mountain climbing trip. War breaks out and he is placed in a prisoner of war camp. He escapes to Tibet where he befriends the young Dalai Lama and witnesses the escalation of the conflict between Tibet and China. Temptation of a monk. 1994, costume drama about China's 7th century Tang dynasty. General Shi, Wu Xianguo, is duped into an assassination plot against the crown prince. After a massacre, the general flees and finds sanctuary with a group of Buddhist monks at a remote temple. Why has Bodhidharma left for the East? 1989. Set in a remote monastery in the Korean mountains, the film follows an old master, close to death, who must lead his disciples in their search for spiritual freedom. Korean with English subtitles.
Are dreams and visions important in Hindu tradition?
Dreams and visions are often described as the means by which particularly holy individuals receive special knowledge or responsibilities. Spiritually advanced members of different denominations describe experiences in which their particular chosen deity appears and manifests his or her divine form. The deity's desires for the founding of a temple in a particular place are often communicated in dreams or visions. Traditional Hindu psychology considers dreaming one of the 4 ordinary states of consciousness. Founders of various denominations and sects often report dreams or visions as the impetus for a personal conversion or for proclaiming a new teaching.
The two schools. What are Hinduism's various spiritual paths?
Karma/action, proper ritual and ethical action as a means to spiritual progress, including purification of one's deeds through detachment from the fruits of one's actions. Jnana/knowledge, attainment of intuitive or mystical understanding of the essential unity of all reality, resulting from meditative approach to the scriptures and wisdom traditions. Bhakti/devotion, participation in the divine life through devotion to a chosen manifestation of the deity. Complete emotional attachment to the chosen deity, and unselfish service to God.
Do Vaishnavites have special feasts in honor of Vishnu or his avatars?
Rama Navami, Rama 9th, during Chatra in early spring, celebrates Rama's birthday. During a 9-day festival, celebrants attend a lengthy retelling of the massive epic Ramayana. A related feast occurs on the 15th of Shravan, a full moon celebration of Rama's crossing over to Lanka to rescue Sita. Two major feasts focus on Krishna. Krishna Janmashtami, birthday. 8th during the dark half of Shravan, in late summer, celebrates Krishna's birthday. For a full 7 days, devotees reenact events from Krishna's life. The festivities culminate with a fast and midnight worship on the 7th day, the eve of the birthday. Naga Panchami, Serpent 5th, so named because it occurs on the 5th day of Shravan's bright half. Comes in late summer and recalls one of Krishna's many victories over embodiments of evil. His dispatching of the serpent demon Kaliya in the river Jumna. Although the evil demon in this case is a serpent. The fast and feast celebrate the grace represented by other cosmically beneficial serpents as well. Several feasts also recall other specific avatars. For example, on the full moon of Kartika, some Vaishnavites celebrate Vishnu's descent as the Savi or fish Matsya.
Are there distinctive forms of Hindu initiation?
Boys of the twice-born castes are initiated into the tradition in special ceremonies called Upanayana, which mark the beginning of formal instruction in sacred learning. The initiate receives a thread and wears it draped across the shoulder as a symbol of this second birth. Women no longer receive the thread and only Brahmins nowadays wear it when not engaged in ritual ceremonies. Sacred threads are of white wool for Brahmins, of red hemp for Kshatriyas, and of yellow wool for Vaishyas. Tradition dictated that Brahmins be initiated at 7 or 8 years of age, Kshatriyas at 11, and Vaishyas at 12. But regardless of caste, most of those who still engage in the formal ceremony generally associate it with puberty.
What were the 4 passing sites?
On several occasions the young Gautama had to leave the confines of the palace. Although his father instructed his servants to clear the road of any unsightly reminders of human frailty, Gautama would nevertheless find himself asking the hardest questions of all. On one excursion, he saw someone bent and struggling to walk. Old age, his servants explained, a hardship many people must eventually face. Another time, Gautama spotted a leper lying by the way in pain. That was illness, his servants explained, it happened to many people. Then one day Gautama's entourage came across a funeral procession. Death, said his servants, and no one escapes that. Finally, according to the traditional account. Gautama saw by the road a young man who obviously possessed nothing and yet seemed content. That was the world renouncer Shuddhodana so badly wanted his son not to become. The traditional account holds that all of the four experiences resulted from divine intervention. The gods assuming the roles of suffering human beings so that Gautama would be moved to take the next critical steps in ensuring the possibility of enlightenment for humankind. The clearly formulaic account admirably sums up the key issues that would eventually provide the foundations of Gautama's enlightenment and Buddhahood.
What is the celebration called Diwali?
Diwali is one of the most important and widely celebrated of all Hindu observances. Also called Deepavali, or Row of Lights, this feast occurs in mid-autumn. October or November, technically from the 13th of Ashvina's dark half to the 2nd of Kartika's bright half. Composed of 5 distinct day-long festivities devoted to such mythic events as Krishna's conquest of 2 demons and Shiva's reconciliation with Parvati. Shaivites and Vaishnavites alike observe the occasion, marking it as theirs by dedicating the middle night of the 5 to either Kali's bringing Shiva under control or Vishnu's consort Lakshmi, respectively. Socially speaking, the feast belongs to the merchant castes. Diwali, strictly so called, occurs on the 4th day, recalling Rama's return to his royal throne in Ayodhya to end his 14-year exile.
What are some basic Hindu ethical considerations?
Hindu tradition describes a range of morally and religiously acceptable goals or motives for action. What matters most is not the substance of the particular type of goal, but the quality of one's intentions. All good things in life are gifts of God. One has only to learn how best to use and value them. In the greater scheme of things, 3 of the 4 major goals are means rather than ends in themselves. Even so, a devout Hindu can pursue them with vigor and determination. As long as the pursuit is balanced and not obsessive. Most fundamental is the goal of Dharma, the quest for one's own individual ethical calling in accord with the cosmic law that holds all things together. Personal justice and righteousness are the cardinal virtues. But wealth, material success, power, and social status, artha, are also worthy goals, so long as one keeps them in perspective. People who use their worldly success in ethically laudable ways are exercising responsible stewardship and can make wonderful things happen for the benefit of many. In addition, a devout Hindu can enjoy to the full all of life's legitimate pleasures. Kama, associated with culture, the arts, sexuality, and family life. This traditional teaching undercuts the common stereotype of Hinduism as world-rejecting and self-denying asceticism. On the other hand, the opposite stereotype that identifies Hinduism as the kind of wild-eyed lust sometimes associated with the Kama Sutra is equally inappropriate. Ultimately, Hindu tradition teaches the sincere seeker will find that none of the first three goals offers permanent satisfaction. What remains is the quest for final liberation from the enslavement that goes with even well-moderated attachments. Moksha, meaning release, is the only goal worthy of being considered an end in itself. Most people will spend many lifetimes striving for it.
What do Hindus believe about life after death?
At the heart of Hindu belief about the nature of human life is a notion called metempsychosis, also called reincarnation or transmigration of soul. Life is an infinite continuum punctuated by episodes of embodiment. Death is therefore the opposite of birth, not of life. One can escape the cycle of birth and death by liberating the soul, freeing the self from all attachments. According to the law of karma, human beings always get what they wish for in spades. If my every effort in this life is the selfish acquisition of wealth or power or pleasure, chances are I will die wanting more. Unsatisfied desire is a form of energy so potent that it keeps the self ensnared in the bonds of attachment that ensure the soul will experience yet another embodiment in some form or another. Hindus call this potentially endless cycle of rebirth samsara.
How do Hindus deal ritually with death and mourning?
Hindus generally prefer cremation to burial, and most hope that their loved ones will scatter their ashes over the waters of the Ganges or one of India's many other sacred rivers. Every year many thousands of Hindu families bring the bodies of their loved ones to Benares for cremation at the burning ghats, steps, toward the downstream side of the holy city. There, or closer to home if they cannot travel easily. Led by the eldest son or an older male relative, the family completes a set of ancient rituals. They bathe and dress the body and light the pyre. The ritual leader walks 4 times to the left around the pyre and pours ghee over the body while the family chant divine names. For anywhere from 8 days to a month the family observes a period of mourning and ritual impurity. To bring that period to a close, many families arrange a ritual meal called shraddha. Relatives must minister to and nourish the dead person's spirit, lest it continue to travel abroad as a restless and potentially troublesome demon. In the case of a famous Brahmin, an extended period of mourning might last a full year. Especially holy persons, such as noted gurus, are sometimes not cremated but buried, seated upright in the lotus posture. Some sects, such as the Lingayats or Virashaivas, prefer burial for all members, possibly the result of Islamic influence. Hindus in Europe and the United States generally cremate their dead within 24 hours of death. Mourners, wearing mostly white, gather at the home for a final viewing. Family members often arrange a memorial service in the local temple to observe the death anniversary.
What is holy?
Originally a fertility festival, this late winter celebration of several days, ending with the full moon of Falguna, is named after the demoness Holika. She was in the habit of eating a child each day until a holy widow summoned all the children to curse the demoness together. Amid great hubbub, participants today let out the kind of energy the children must have unleashed on Holika. They throw multicolored powders and liquids on each other. Evidently a visual remnant of the children's curses. By a fascinating process of association, the celebration has also come to embrace the mythological downfall of evil female figures. For example, Krishna destroyed the demoness Putana, whom the evil king Kamsa had sent, disguised as a wet nurse, to kill the infant deity by poisoning him with her breast milk.
Who was the Buddha and what does tradition say about his early life?
According to widely accepted tradition, a child called Siddhartha. He who has achieved his goal, Gautama, was born around 563 BCE. Recent scholarship has begun to offer various views as to the chronology of the Buddha's life. But this text will retain the more traditional account since it conveys an important sense of the feel of Buddhist lore. Siddhartha's father, Shuddhodana, was a wealthy member of the ruling elite, a prince of sorts. When the child was born, his father consulted religious specialists to see what portents the boy's body might communicate. They told him the child was destined to become either a world renouncer or a wheel turner, Chakravartin, an expression roughly equivalent to mover and shaker and sometimes extended to mean king of all India. Shuddhodana resolved that his son would take the path of power and influence. So he contrived to shelter the boy from any experience that might incline him another way. Gautama lived a life of ease and pleasure in his father's palace. Surrounded by wealth and beauty and the trappings of authority, he married at 16 and had a son. As it turned out, Gautama's father failed to insulate his son from contact with the harsher side of life. Eventually Gautama would leave the palace, as well as his own wife and child, and seek his own path. The traditional story is clearly meant to underscore certain dramatic elements in the Buddha's spiritual development. His son, Rahula, reappears later in the story as one of the early monks, and his wife is said to have become one of the first nuns.
Are any feasts dedicated especially to the goddesses?
Durga Puja, also called Navaratri, 9 nights, occurs at the fall equinox in honor of Shiva's consort Durga. As the slayer of the buffalo demon, Durga Mahishasura Mardini. Durga represents the power of good to quell all sources of evil. Devotees celebrate this deity's complete protection of her worshippers. But Durga's festival has room for other deities as well. The first day celebrates the goddess Sarasvati, patroness of learning and beauty. In some regions the fifth day belongs to a goddess called Lalita. Bengalis sometimes still sacrifice water buffalo in honor of Durga's cosmic victory over evil. Another festival, occurring at the end of winter to welcome spring, is called Shri Panchami, goddess' fifth day in the bright half of Magha. Devotees honor Sarasvati by piling up books and symbols of learning near local altars. Other days, such as several during the extended feast called Diwali, also belong to the major goddesses.
Do Hindus believe in angels?
Nothing in Hindu lore corresponds exactly to the spiritual beings known in some traditions as angels. But a host of lesser deities, called devatas, and spirits make up the entourages of many of the major deities. These versatile beings are often grouped in families whose mission is to do their deities' every bidding. Like the angels in some traditions, lesser deities fill the spiritual air around the major deities. In popular spirituality, devotees often consider the need to render an account to these divine vanguards nearly equal to their duties to the central deity. For the lesser deities preside over essential areas of life such as fertility, childbirth, and disease. Those that wield more positive energies have their darker counterparts that need to be appeased in order to hold evil at bay. Among the more common beings of this rank are the door guardians, Dvarapalas, who keep undesirable elements out of temples and away from the shrines of the deities to whom they are assigned. Door guardians are often depicted with iconographic clues very similar to those of their major deities. So, for example, guardians in a Vaishnavite temple typically have 4 arms and are equipped with Vishnu's conch shell, discus, and mace.
When and where did Buddhism begin?
Buddhism began in a region of northeast India, part of which is present-day Nepal. During the mid-6th century BCE, the kingdom of Koshala ruled the area from its capital city of Shravasthi, also known as Kapilavastu. One of the realm's leading factions was the Shakya clan, traditionally identified as belonging to the Kshatriya or warrior caste. India at that time was politically fragmented into well over a dozen major regional powers. The vast majority of the population practiced forms of Hindu Tradition under the leadership of a strong Brahmin priesthood. Ritual and belief centered largely on this worldly concerns, such as managing weather to ensure good harvest and curing illness. But some who had inherited the ancient tradition were beginning to question its efficacy. The famed holy city of Benares was part of the Koshala realm. There and elsewhere in the kingdom, individuals and small groups of religious seekers raised issues about possible life after death, including the notion of rebirth into other modes of existence. Within the Hindu tradition, the new questioning gave rise to the scriptures called the Upanishads. With their deep reflection on the nature of the self and of greater spiritual realities. Some of these new seekers parted company with mainstream Hindu tradition altogether, and eventually developed into whole new communities of belief and practice. One such community is now called the Jain tradition, named after the Jinas or spiritual conquerors to whom tradition attributes its founding spirit. The demanding ascetic discipline taught by Jainism's Tirthankaras, those who find crossing places in the river, formed one of the religious options available as early Buddhism developed. Buddhism itself would join Jainism as one of a number of splinter groups that, from a Hindu perspective, were unacceptable. These heretics got the name Nastika. Those who deny the fundamentals of Hindu belief as it was evolving then. What we now call Buddhism thus grew out of an age of political and spiritual ferment, offering seekers one of a number of significant religious options.
How do Hindus ritualize marriage?
Traditional Hindu families continue the ancient practice of arranged marriage and generally do not countenance the kind of dating practices prevalent among non-Hindus in the United States. Marriage within one's caste remains a major concern for most Hindus, whether within India or abroad. An extended period of betrothal usually follows the initial arrangements between the families, and includes the exchange of gifts and chaperoned meetings of the betrothed. Ceremonies typically occur in the early evening, after sunset, in a venue chosen by the families. In the temple, the home, or at a local hotel. One or more priests preside over the ceremony, reciting set ritual texts from the scriptures. In India, one priest often appears as a representative for each family. Astrological consultation still often determines the specific auspicious timing of the ceremony. Wedding ceremonies begin with the family of the bride symbolically giving away their daughter. After the community greets the new couple, the officiant chants special prayers while the bride and groom sit before a fire holding hands. Concluding the formal ritual, the bride and groom express consent by taking the 7 steps symbolizing energy, vitality, success, happiness, wealth. Traditionally measured in livestock, auspicious turning of the seasons, and friendship. Extended receptions generally follow the ceremonies.
What is the practice known as sati?
The word Sati originally referred to a woman of virtue. A reference to a newly widowed individual who joined her husband in death by throwing herself on his funeral pyre. The name comes from Shiva's wife Sati, who committed suicide after her father insulted her new husband. Ritual suicide by widows spread through medieval times and continued well into the early modern era. Even after the practice was outlawed in 1829, it continued in many villages. Incidents of Sati still occasionally make headlines. But increasing social action on behalf of women's rights continues to improve the situation all over India.
Who are some important women in the history of Hindu spirituality?
Ancient tradition acknowledges that some anonymous women were among the authors of the Vedic hymns. Many other women whose names we know have made major contributions throughout the history of Hinduism. Here is a brief introduction to 4 of the better-known women from various denominations. Antal, 725–55 CE, was one of the Alvars, poet saints in the Vaishnava tradition. She was most famous for poetry in which she described her relationship with Vishnu in the language of bridal mysticism. Seeing herself as the spouse of Vishnu, she shares the spiritual longing of women mystics in other traditions who speak of total loving union with God. Devotees still sing hymns that set her poems to music. Mahadevi was a 12th century devotee of Shiva and a renowned poet in the Kannada language. In the temple of her village, the principal deity was a form of Shiva called Mallikarjun, Lord White as Jasmine. Like Antal, she thought of herself as betrothed to God alone. She was apparently forced into an unhappy marriage, and much of her poetry alludes to the suffering she experienced and her longing to be liberated and live for God alone. A late medieval holy woman named Mirabai, 1498–1550, was a devotee of Krishna. She thought of herself as a gopi who had been hopelessly enamored of the dark Lord. After extricating herself from an unsatisfactory marriage, she became a sannyasi and composed love songs in Hindi, a vernacular tongue in west-central India. Finally, a woman known by the honorific title Anandamayi Ma, bliss-steeped mother, lived in modern-day Bengal, now Bangladesh. Nirmala Sundari, 1896–1982, lived a most colorful life, often flouting strict tradition in favor of sometimes highly symbolic or ecstatic behavior. In her later years she opted for a more settled life, founding an ashram and ministering to disciples who sought her out for spiritual guidance.
What signs or symbols distinguish Hindu religious specialists?
Priests in most Hindu temples, whatever the denomination, generally wear a simple body wrap that covers one or both shoulders. Sometimes they will remove the upper wrap altogether. Priests may wear a white thread across the left shoulder. A symbol of initiation into the sacred scriptures. Some priests wear a set of beads, called a mala, or rosary, used to count in the repetition of sacred words or syllables. Around the neck or wrist. Members of various monastic orders often wear a saffron or salmon-colored robe that is the habit or distinctive garb of the organization. Shaivite sadhus sometimes carry the trident, a symbol sacred to Shiva.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Hindu?
A small dot on the forehead, called a bindu or bindai, is perhaps the most common individual symbol in Hinduism. Many Indian women wear a small round red dot in the middle of the forehead to indicate that they are married. And some wear a black dot to ward off evil prior to marriage. Some regard the red dot as a generic symbol of one's Hindu faith, as worn by both men and women. Hindus in Europe and the United States sometimes have difficulty deciding whether to wear the dot in public or whether to confine its use to worship. As with so many personal religious symbols, it has become associated with issues of religious distinctiveness and cultural assimilation. Some believe the dot alludes to Shiva's third eye, a symbol of wisdom and divine power. Shaivites often wear 3 parallel horizontal lines on the forehead, and often on upper arms and on the chest as well. The marks are sometimes made with paint and sometimes with ash to symbolize cremation. Vaishnavites wear what appears to be a large V or double V on the forehead and sometimes on the upper arm.
How did Buddhism develop in the Himalayas?
Like Vietnam, the Himalayan kingdoms, Tibet, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, also became part of the northern transmission. But they're the various lineages that constitute Vajrayana, thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism took hold. Tibet was the homeland of this branch of the faith. With its distinctive blend of indigenous shamanism and esoteric interpretations of the Buddha's teaching. Tibetan Buddhists also developed their own extensive scriptural canon. Of all the subdivisions of the monastic Sangha that evolved across Asia, none is more varied and colorful than that of the Vajrayana. From its most famous lineage, the Gelugpa, comes the succession of holy men called Dalai Lamas.
How did Buddhism develop in the Himalayas?
Like Vietnam, the Himalayan kingdoms, Tibet, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, also became part of the northern transmission. But they're the various lineages that constitute Vajrayana, thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism took hold. Tibet was the homeland of this branch of the faith. With its distinctive blend of indigenous shamanism and esoteric interpretations of the Buddha's teaching. Tibetan Buddhists also developed their own extensive scriptural canon. Of all the subdivisions of the monastic Sangha that evolved across Asia, none is more varied and colorful than that of the Vajrayana. From its most famous lineage, the Gelugpa, comes the succession of holy men called Dalai Lamas.
How was Buddhism spread through Southeast Asia?
Buddhists call the spread of the tradition through lineages of teachers and students Dharma transmission. Sri Lanka was one of the first regions outside of India to form a link in the southern transmission. A lineage known as the Theravada, wisdom of the elders, was introduced to Sri Lanka as early as the 3rd century BCE. It spread into Burma and was well rooted there by about the 5th or 6th century CE. Their Buddhism benefited from the patronage of King Anuruddha, 1044–77. Under whose dynasty Burma became almost entirely Buddhist. According to tradition, Ashoka's own missionaries brought the faith to Thailand as early as the 3rd century BCE. The earliest solid evidence of Buddhism in Thailand is indigenous Buddhist art from 8 or 9 centuries later. In Kampuchea, formerly called Cambodia, a blend of Mahayana and Hindu beliefs were dominant around the royal complexes of Angkor toward the end of the first millennium. Theravada teaching came to the fore after about 1200. But its institutions have just barely survived disastrous political upheavals of the late 20th century. Vietnam seems to have participated in the Theravada transmission early on. But missionaries from China succeeded in establishing Mahayana teaching there between about 1000 and 1400.
How was Buddhism spread through Southeast Asia?
Buddhists call the spread of the tradition through lineages of teachers and students Dharma transmission. Sri Lanka was one of the first regions outside of India to form a link in the southern transmission. A lineage known as the Theravada, wisdom of the elders, was introduced to Sri Lanka as early as the 3rd century BCE. It spread into Burma and was well rooted there by about the 5th or 6th century CE. Their Buddhism benefited from the patronage of King Anuruddha, 1044–77. Under whose dynasty Burma became almost entirely Buddhist. According to tradition, Ashoka's own missionaries brought the faith to Thailand as early as the 3rd century BCE. The earliest solid evidence of Buddhism in Thailand is indigenous Buddhist art from 8 or 9 centuries later. In Kampuchea, formerly called Cambodia, a blend of Mahayana and Hindu beliefs were dominant around the royal complexes of Angkor toward the end of the first millennium. Theravada teaching came to the fore after about 1200. But its institutions have just barely survived disastrous political upheavals of the late 20th century. Vietnam seems to have participated in the Theravada transmission early on. but missionaries from China succeeded in establishing Mahayana teaching there between about 1000 and 1400.
How did Buddhism become important in China, Korea, and Japan?
Buddhism's spread across North and East Asia was an extended and complex process. That was part of the northern transmission begun as early as the reign of Ashoka. Serious missionary efforts commenced in China sometime during the 1st century CE. Within a century or so, a new wave of monk translators from India was engaged in large-scale proselytizing among the Chinese. Buddhism spread rapidly and flourished in the form of several denominations and schools. Some estimate that over half the population had accepted the new tradition by around 450 CE. A major persecution in 845 under a deist emperor did serious damage to all but the Pure Land and Chen, Zen, lineages. A Chinese missionary monk introduced Buddhism to Korea around the late 4th century. By the mid-6th century, Buddhism enjoyed royal patronage and spread throughout the Korean peninsula. In about 552 the Korean monarch sent the Japanese emperor as a gift, an image of the Buddha and some sacred texts. The new faith soon found itself welcome, and adapted rapidly in the land of the rising sun. Monks from China and Korea continued to bring the teachings of various denominations to Japan during the 7th and 8th centuries. Those schools proved attractive to relatively small numbers of people. So during the early 9th century, 3 Japanese monks who had been studying in China brought back simpler teachings with greater popular appeal. Several schools based on Pure Land teaching enjoyed considerable success over the next 300 years. Then a new wave of Buddhist growth and development washed over Japan in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Honen, 1133 to 1212, established the Pure Land School as a distinct denomination. And 2 Japanese monks founded the main branches of Zen Buddhism.
How did Buddhism become important in China, Korea, and Japan?
Buddhism spread across North and East Asia was an extended and complex process. That was part of the northern transmission begun as early as the reign of Ashoka. Serious missionary efforts commenced in China sometime during the 1st century CE. Within a century or so, a new wave of monk translators from India was engaged in large-scale proselytizing among the Chinese. Buddhism spread rapidly and flourished in the form of several denominations and schools. Some estimate that over half the population had accepted the new tradition by around 450 CE. A major persecution in 845 under a deist emperor did serious damage to all but the Pure Land and Chen, Zen, lineages. A Chinese missionary monk introduced Buddhism to Korea around the late 4th century. By the mid-6th century, Buddhism enjoyed royal patronage and spread throughout the Korean peninsula. In about 552 the Korean monarch sent the Japanese emperor, as a gift, an image of the Buddha and some sacred texts. The new faith soon found itself welcome, and adapted rapidly in the land of the rising sun. Monks from China and Korea continued to bring the teachings of various denominations to Japan during the 7th and 8th centuries. Those schools proved attractive to relatively small numbers of people. So during the early 9th century, 3 Japanese monks who had been studying in China brought back simpler teachings with greater popular appeal. Several schools based on Pure Land teaching enjoyed considerable success over the next 300 years. Then a new wave of Buddhist growth and development washed over Japan in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Honen, 1133 to 1212, established the Pure Land School as a distinct denomination. And 2 Japanese monks founded the main branches of Zen Buddhism.